Right then, so last session we looked at networks on a bigger kind of scale, looking at whether they were local or wide area networks. Today we're going to look at things from a different perspective. We're going to look at why sometimes when you're on a network, things run smoothly, you're able to do what you want straight away, whereas on other days it feels like you can't get anything done and your videos buffer and that kind of thing. Okay, so as far as GCSE computer science is concerned, these are your 4 factors that affect the performance of a network. And we're going to look at each one. So we're going to look at bandwidth, the number of users on a network and how that affects it, what type of connection you're using, and how different pieces of hardware or the topology, which is the setup of your network, how those affect how fast your network is running. So let's start by looking at bandwidth. Now, bandwidth is described as the amount of data that can be transferred within a given time. Now, hopefully you know me well enough by now. It's underlined, so it's important. If you want the marks in the exam, most students remember to put that bandwidth is the amount of data that can be transferred, but they don't put within a given time. Now, that is super important because we're talking about how much data can be transferred per second or per minute or that kind of thing. Obviously, the greater the bandwidth, so the more data that you can transfer at once, the better the network will be, the smoother it will run. So we'll move on to the next point. How many users and what you're doing on that network plays a major part in how fast you are able to complete your tasks. So if we know that bandwidth is the amount of data that can be transferred at over a given time, it makes sense that if you've only got 2 or 3 people using that bandwidth, they're going to have a far smoother experience than if you've got 30 people sharing that same amount of bandwidth. However, you then need to factor in what are they doing. If you have got users streaming videos, that obviously takes up more bandwidth because more data is being transferred. So that can slow the network down. Now, something that your network manager can do to try and limit the performance loss is they can limit the amount of bandwidth that each user can access. So that might mean if you are on a school or a college network, you might not be able to stream videos because you're not given that bandwidth allowance. But what it does mean is a greater number of users can all access the websites they need for the research that they're carrying out. Okay, so moving on to our next factor. What type of connection have you got to your network? Now, generally speaking, wired connections, can't speak today, wired connections are faster and more reliable than wireless connections. However, we need to drill down further into that because there's different types of wired connections. There's different things that affect your wireless network. So next lesson or next video, we're going to be looking at hardware in more detail and looking at why it's the case that fibre optic cables allow faster data transfer than copper cables. In terms of wireless, it depends on a range of things. What device are you using and how far is the range of that wireless access? Other devices can interfere. Now, there was a news article at the start of lockdown saying you can't use your microwave whilst you're on a video call. It affects your Wi-Fi performance. And physical obstructions. If you've got a big thick wall between you and your device, that's going to affect how effectively you can access your wireless connection. Okay, and lastly, a little bit of a cop-out, I'm not sure. The last factor that affects performance is the hardware devices you're using and the way that your network is set up, which we call network topology. Now, these are both separate videos and separate lessons because there's quite a lot of content for each of those. Once we've covered those, you'll be able to give more detail. But for now, all you need to know is that they are a factor that will affect the performance of your network. Okay, this video is short and sweet. listen to it again, make sure you've got all the key phrases in there, and particularly with the definitions like bandwidth, make sure you've got all the detail. Okay.